to the second part of the proceedings. We had some fascinating presentations in the first part. I'm still trying to get to grips with the idea of a synthetic revolutionary, but I think it's a term that's got a lot of utility. And I'm also intrigued by the idea that woke is an ideology without a sense of the future, which makes it very unusual indeed. But perhaps we can take up some of those themes in the Q&A at the end of this second part. To begin with, we've got Pierre Valentin from France, who's actually written a French version of woke, l'idéologie woke, and he's from the Fondation pour l'Innovation Politique, or Political Innovation Foundation, and he writes for Le Figaro, and he's working on a book on post-Protestantism and woke ideology. Pierre will be followed by Dakota Wood, who's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Dakota was in the US Marine Corps and served as a lead operational logistics planner for the US CENTCOM during the initial operational response to the attacks of September the 11th, and served as a strategist for the US Marine Corps. And he'll have an interesting and no doubt very positive things to say about critical race theory and the American military. And finally, but not least, we have Rod Dreher, who's a best-selling author of Live Not by Lies and The Benedict Option, who's currently at the Danube Institute as a director of our network project. And he'll also have some interesting things to say about the critical race implications for faith-based institutions. So Pierre first, and we'll follow Pierre with Dakota and Rod. Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here amongst such great speakers and intellectuals. I certainly wouldn't have imagined this something like 2 years ago. The great thing with the woke takeover of the West, I don't think many people expected the speech to start this way. The great thing with the woke takeover of the West is that it got the Americans and the English to be jealous of the French again. But are they right to be? I had a disagreement with a compatriot a few months ago on who was doing a better job resisting the woke tsunami between France and the United Kingdom. 2 weeks in Oxford was enough to convince him he was wrong. I can't tell whether it was the LGBTQ badges slapped on every student that swayed him, or being asked his pronouns by a 60-year-old mathematician in a private conversation. France is a shining light, a beacon of hope for those who seek to resist wokism around the world. Or so my Anglophone friends tell me. To quote the Telegraph last February, here's something the French get right. They can't stand woke. In this article, they flaunt our staunch resistance. Diversion, inclusion, and equity appear to be no match for liberté, égalité, fraternité, especially with a little bit of laïcité, the very French version of secularism, sprinkled on top. Of course, many people point to the issue of language, insisting that such a level of resistance is largely due to the latency in translation. But language is not everything. Friends from Francophone nations like Belgium and Quebec keep coming over too and saying, "You have no idea how lucky you are here. You cannot imagine how much weaker political correctness is in France, how much more freedom of speech you actually have in practice. We can't say half of what you guys boldly proclaim. Wokism is so much worse back home." Even in France, many people believe this too. In fact, ironically, many centrist or leftist media outlets bang this drum repeatedly to try to maintain their denial. aiming to downplay French wokism precisely by highlighting how much worse it is everywhere else in the Western world, with the exception of Hungary, of course. The author Sylvain Tesson once said several years ago that France is a paradise filled with people who believe they live in hell. Has this become true again today? Let's take a look at the facts. Let us first start with a quick recap of how things panned out when this victimhood mentality hit the coasts of France. The international George Floyd shockwave rippled over our businesses, and a few big firms started to virtue signal. But a more aggressive warning shot was observed in a university located in the city of Grenoble towards the end of 2022. The names of two professors accused of Islamophobia were plastered on the walls of the institution by some students. Please bear in mind that these events took place only a few months after the school teacher Samuel Paty had been ruthlessly beheaded because he too had been publicly branded an Islamophobe by some parents. In such a context, the intention behind the act was clear, or at the very least, the risk had been consciously accepted. In any case, the authorities decided to place them under police protection. Those familiar with the events, such as those of Evergreen State University in 2017, will not be surprised by what follows. Once again, the university administration inverted the victims and the perpetrators, with the students flying by the disciplinary committee scot-free, whilst Klaus Kinsler, one of the targeted teachers, was suspended, precisely for having underlined in the press his lack of institutional support. On the 13th of January 2021, a group of brave academics decided to found the Observatoire du décolonialisme to counter the influence of post-colonial activism in French academia. Their first article is bold and clear, but the word woke is not yet used. This is because it doesn't really exist yet in the public sphere. In March, a center-left magazine places the word woke on its cover. In July 2021, I published for a center-right think tank, La Fondation pour l'Innovation Politique, the first ever study of woke ideology to come out in France. Heavily based on Anglophone sources, with books such as The Rise of Victimhood Culture, Cynical Theories, The Coddling of the American Mind, as well as many of Christopher Rufo's investigations, it reaches a wide audience slowly becoming aware of the new cultural shift underway and eager to find out more about what was happening beneath its feet. By the autumn, woke, or le wokisme, is the new buzzword, with politicians scrambling to demonstrate they too know what it means. Initially, many centrist figures, part of Emmanuel Macron's government, do not shy away from using it and attacking what the movement really represents. Initially, the subject is not that controversial, an intellectual curiosity from abroad. Initially, the people on the French left criticizing those who use the word appears small, a minority. This initial moment lasts for a few months at best. In mid-October of 2021, the then Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, decides to launch his own anti-woke think tank, as it was first presented. He had asked me several weeks before in his office to help him with this project. He was from a centrist government. The attacks he had to withstand from the left-wing press for this stance became increasingly violent. When Macron was re-elected in 2022, Blanquer was not only not reinstated, he was replaced by a very different man, Pape Ndiaye. Ever since he had studied in the US, this new Minister of Education decided to make it his mission to be the founder of Black Studies in France, and, I quote, wanted to contribute to the emergence of a collective black voice. By replacing Blanquer in such a way, our president sent out the signal that he would prefer critical race theory to anti-wokeism, critical consciousness to French universalism, although he would probably never explicitly say it that way. In fact, he continues to pay lip service to the ideals of the French Republic, which seems to be enough for many centrists to be reassured. By then, academic circles and the majority of the left-wing press had started weaving a very narrow set of arguments, strikingly similar to what many of you have heard countless times on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. In Douglas Murray's latest book, he aptly summarized the various contradictory arguments put forth by large parts of the American media surrounding the CRT debate. I quote, "At the same time that critical race theory did not exist, it was not taught in schools. It was taught, and that was a good thing, although it was also too complex for most mortals to understand. Nevertheless, we should congratulate those who invented such a clear and necessary theory." In France, the inconsistent triad we got was A, wokism does not exist, B, wokism is a great new invention, C, wokism has always existed. Academics, journalists, and intellectuals started explaining on TV that the word had never been used positively before, trying to obfuscate its evident Black Lives Matter origins. The term became pilloried as obscure and inherently undefinable, even though one could offer the following definition relatively painlessly: an ideology which perceives Western societies as being fundamentally ruled by structures of oppression, hierarchies of domination, and systems of power, which have the effect, whether voluntarily or not, of inferiorizing the other with a capital O, i.e. various minority figures, whether they be sexual, religious, or ethnic minorities, through often invisible means. Furthermore, the woke are those who know this and make it their life's goal to awaken others to this terrible state of affairs by attracting attention, raising awareness, and performing social activism, such as publicly cancelling those who appear to deviate from this goal. That is neither obscure nor undefinable. In all of this, the French left has started to look more and more like the American left, suffering from a 2-year jet lag. Not only did the young activists rehash the same two arguments, conservative moral panic and the word is meaningless, it also sought to silence first and foremost the old left, which it labeled as far right and conservative. Does any of this ring a bell? In 2019, the New York Times stopped printing its satirical comic strips entirely. France, the country of Charlie Hebdo and Voltaire, could never do such a thing. Well, in 2021, illustrator Xavier Gorce ended up deciding to leave the French equivalent of the NYT, left-wing Le Monde, to enjoy more artistic freedom in a center-right magazine. Barry Weiss had followed a similar trajectory a few years earlier on the other side of the ocean. The same ideas yield the same consequences. Huge intellectual figures from the old French left have also had to flee from Le Monde to Le Figaro, from left to right. The feminist thinker Elisabeth Badinter exemplifies this old left, which is shell-shocked at the speed of its own demise. As she phrased it herself about a year ago, one part of the left has adopted this woke ideology. Another part does not necessarily agree, but silently follows, so as not to be labeled as being on the side of the executioners. Similarly, in 2020, there was an anti-woke article signed by Noam Chomsky, Salman Rushdie, J.K. Rowling, Margaret Atwood, Francis Fukuyama, Steven Pinker, as well as Yasha Monk, which talked of a mounting intolerance amongst the left. I say anti-woke, but the word itself was not used, which was perhaps in itself a prelude of things to come. Today, most of these figures are considered in many spheres as fascists, Islamophobes, transphobes, or worse, right-wing, despite the fact that they all come from the left and have usually remained quite stable in their beliefs. Let's move on to cancellations. We have those too. The Argentinian academic Leonardo Orlando had the insane idea of trying to teach Charles Darwin's insights in one of France's most illustrious universities. His course, which focused on applying the theory of natural selection to the explanation of behavioral differences between men and women, was cancelled less than 2 weeks before it could start, due to a minority of students complaining. Maybe he too had believed what the Anglophone world says of us. Welcome to France, Leonardo, the land of liberty and unanimous resistance to cancel culture. In order to demonstrate and quantify the growing ideological influence of our young radicals, let us focus on the following case study: the spread of what they call l'écriture inclusive, one specifically French woke move is to take the most beautiful language of all time and then fragment it by placing a full stop at the end of many words, followed by an additional E in order to feminize them. It is a bit like writing Latin X, except it concerns potentially every single French noun or verb and pisses off less Mexicans. They call this act of literary terrorism écriture inclusive, which we could translate as inclusive writing, despite the fact that it will exclude people with dyslexia and learning difficulties from savoring the joys of French. This lexical virtue signaling serves as a useful political litmus test and thermometer. In the 2012 presidential election, not a single left-wing candidate used it. In 2017, a few of them dabbled in it, one candidate even writing his entire political program this way. By 2022, a majority of left-wing candidates did this. Which one of them will dare to do otherwise by 2027? In general, you will now be hard-pressed to find a young French left-winger who isn't woke, and one who is willing to say so publicly would be harder still to unearth. Demographically speaking, this is a gloomy reality for the old guard, subverted from within. And as we know, apparent consensus is often the prelude to genuine consensus, or at the very least, the former always gives the impression of the latter. It should also be noted that even the left, which fights against wokeism, now hardly ever uses the term woke itself, thereby conceding a first semantic defeat. The hedonistic baby boomers are giving way to this new generation of promiscuous Puritans, as we should call them. Now that it's the rest of the French left that are the minority, we now know how wokeness actually treats the minorities it truly lives with. And it's not a pretty sight. The hashtags and cancellations which target the old left, especially concerning the trans debate, can be particularly cruel. Yet, as you all know too well, many centrists and moderate leftists refuse to support their comrades and shy away from any controversy. Their obligation appears to lie no longer in searching for the truth, but only in combating the far right. Instead of taking the risk of dealing with the rot within, they prefer to focus on the big bad walls without. Hence, they feed the tiger, seeking to appease the radicals at every turn. Perhaps they don't realize that they are simply negotiating the luxury of facing the guillotine last. I hope to have dampened your jealousy a bit. We appear to be catching up with you. Those of you who will return to the UK and the US will be able to tell your friends, you have no idea how backwards the French are. Over there, drag queens have only just begun to tell stories to 3-year-old children. So, if France really is this bad, this really begs the question, why such admiration from abroad? I guess once you believe you are living through hell, it becomes very tempting to believe heaven, the promised land, lies just on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and that they serve filet mignon there too. Also, comparatively speaking, as I said, we are doing considerably better than the US and the United Kingdom. Sometimes it feels like if you remove Christopher Rufo from the US, you are basically left with Canada. So all in all, we are not doing well, we are doing better than. There lies the big difference. The absolute statement is false, the comparative one is true. In France, we have a saying, quand on se regarde, on se désole, quand on se compare, on se console, which translate as, when we look at ourselves, we feel sorry. But when we look at others, we take comfort. I would like to thank Canada in particular for being such a huge source of comfort. But how did this happen to a country that was supposed to be immune to this virus? I mean France, not Canada. The French left has an intellectual corpus which is possibly older than America itself. It conceptualized or fleshed out notions like rationalism, universalism, laïcité, the fact-value gap, a belief in philosophical and political neutrality, a colorblind republic, and the scientific method. Every single one of these things is now considered white and subsequently rejected, not only by the woke left, but increasingly by the left as a whole. French political scientists and philosophers should be spending every living hour trying to make sense of this mystery. How can the same label, left, be used to describe one thing and its opposite in the space of 2 years? How can contradiction come to be perceived as continuity? Of course, one could say that it's a testament to the influence of Anglo-Saxon culture that even the French left is becoming submerged. In fact, many young French activists don't even bother translating the new woke concepts anymore. Ever since the end of the Second World War, France has felt the pull of American culture, much more so than the other way around, something which I think Hungarians understand the dangers of very well. However, there are some ideological explanations too. Many amongst the left have long praised youth for youth's sake, novelty for novelty's sake, and minority status for its own sake too. How could they resist once a younger movement popped up with new minorities to speak on behalf of? On what grounds could they say no? To put this another way, it is the old left's fault if the phrase old left sounds like a contradiction in terms. Step 1, say that the young generation is always right. Step 2, age a few decades. Step 3, lose. I tend to agree with the Catholic thinker Charles Péguy when he says, "Every father on whom his son lays his hand is guilty of having made a son who lays his hand on him." Parts of the left gave birth to the movement that will probably kill it. Yes, wokism will probably kill the left. But will it kill the country? Or, to be more precise, will it do so before it has killed itself? Because yes, wokism simply has to self-destruct, as all purity spirals do. This is already evident around us. Look at the evolutions of the LGBT flag. By constantly adding new shapes and colors in order to become more inclusive, it is doomed to end up as a psychedelic mess, which will include no one. For those who doubt this, I would recommend going to check out Microsoft's version of the flag. Let's say I'm humble enough not to even attempt to describe it here. Another example is the aforementioned inclusive writing in France. The feminizing E added at the end of words was judged insufficiently inclusive by some Swiss students a few years back. They decided to add another letter after the dot, an X, in order to include non-binaries. Now, some words are written as student.e.x. But there's no reason to stop there. That would be excluding the asexuals, the two spirits, and so many others. In time, there is no good reason for the entire alphabet not to place itself at the end of each word. That would spell the death of all communication. Wokism is inherently a parasitical structure, as Christopher Rufo pointed out earlier today. It cannot build, so it can only focus on tearing down a pre-existing civilization, a pre-existing language. But what happens when a parasite has devoured its host? Unless it finds another, it dies. This is what we could call the paradox of the parasite. The parasite's total victory also spells its complete defeat. It has its own negation as a goal, its own end as an end. Can we get rid of it before it gets rid both of us and of itself? Let me conclude by going through 3 different options that are often chosen by conservative dissidents in response to this movement of sheer negation. The first one is to criticize it. I think many people in this room have done that, and often quite well. But merely criticizing the ideology of criticism, negating the negation, will be both deeply paradoxical and gravely insufficient. The second approach is to simply push forth the opposite of woke ideology. But that doesn't require thinking, and the opposite of an error is often another error. A knee-jerk is only a reaction in the lowest sense of the term. The third path often chosen is to slow its speed and spread. But conceding slightly less ground per year than other nations is not winning. It is gently sliding towards destruction. Death by 1,000 cuts, euthanasia by gradual sedation. This is what I sought to demonstrate when talking about France. Breaking may be necessary it will slow the train, but it is not sufficient to change its course. It is certainly not, by definition, a long-term strategy. What will be truly key is something else entirely. In order to get out of this cancer culture, the young woke will have to be offered something better to do with their lives, a better project, and simply taking away their ideological lifeline, even by expertly taking it apart, is doomed to failure. Is there a point in telling someone who is drowning that his safety jacket is carcinogenic? We require instead a common narrative, a unifying breath that would bring together and give life to the scattered dust, separated into a multitude of islands. The desire for unity, hidden beneath a superficial praise for diversity, is the common thread that unites the woke texts. Even though a community based on repudiation does not exist, the desire for one does. Intersectionality cannot function, but the wish to unite that gave rise to it cannot disappear either, for it is deeply lodged within the human soul. As Douglas Murray phrased it, in the absence of anything else, the only public ethic in the West that people are encouraged to unite around is opposition toward itself. Therefore, if we cannot merge a nation around a unifying narrative, then unity will come from its deconstruction. The speed at which wokism is spreading teaches us that unity will necessarily return with or against us. Does the West, be it France, Hungary, or the US, possess a convincing alternative? Can we push or pull anyone in a given moral direction? In other words, are we simply wagons trying to slow down the train, or do we have an engine of our own? Are we going anywhere of our own choosing, or are we merely trying to brake? It seems to me that we are precisely in a make or break situation. We either make a better story to tell, or we simply continue trying to press the brakes, in which case break we will into a million different pieces. Thank you very much.
Great. All right. Now we have Dakota Wood and talking a bit about maybe what Dr. Ferretti was saying. He said it's a bit remarkable that this ideology becomes entrenched in sports, professional sports, basketball, football, baseball, and perhaps the only institution that it's maybe in some ways more surprising is the military. Typically, you'd think of as a very patriotic institution. So very excited to hear his talk. Come up here and let's go.
I'll have to say I was surprised to be invited to this. I was taken by the opening comments, a collection of philosophers and technical experts. I think of myself more as a practitioner in the world of military affairs. 1981, I went off the U.S. Naval Academy, so I've been doing military things for about 40 years, 50 countries, 3 combat zones. So I'm familiar with the military side, all this wokism stuff, and the philosophy and the political underpinnings, I find just fascinating. But what I'm going to try to do is show the linkage between what everybody else has been talking about, how it relates to military stuff, military power, but how insidious and seductive it can be and how destructive ultimately in its manifestations. Critical race theory and its kinfolk really pose 2 threats to Western culture through the imposition on military organizations, in the U.S. specifically, but I think in other organizations, militaries in other countries in a more general sense, in that in full flower, it degrades the integrity and effectiveness of military entities, military units, and the supervisory structures on that. But it also serves, and I'm looking forward to really talking about this, it serves as a mechanism to undermine community values, standards, and norms by the imposition of federal policies that necessarily supersede local and state, right? So if you can grab the federal structures, which cover entire country, then that is one way to impose these sorts of ideologies through military service and organizations. And I was heartened to hear the viral term used in some of these other speeches. And I think you can liken CRT to a virus that weakens and sometimes destroys a body. So it harms that individual specifically. But by doing that, it also harms the things that an otherwise healthy person would be able to do in the areas in which he or she would contribute, right? So by destroying the organization or the organism or the body itself, you're also, through that, harming things on a greater scale. And we're seeing that with these identity politics, diversity, equity, and inclusion, CRT, and that whole kind of family of illnesses. In the U.S. military, this virus is introduced in 3 ways. And it's important to understand, I know in the U.S. system, but I think in many Western democracies, that the military is subordinate to civilian control, right? So the first way the virus is introduced is through the imposition through federal regulations, policies, and especially political appointees. So if you have somebody out of a presidential administration that's been appointed because of their loyalty to the policy agenda of that presidential administration, and they come into the Department of Defense, they will be imposing these sorts of things, and the military, being an obedient organization, is going to salute smartly and do its best because of the integrity that these officers have to impose as best they can or implement these policy prescriptions. Okay, it will generate some friction, but the alternative to that is a military that says no and defies federal regulation and orders, then you have a complete breakdown. So it comes from top down. It comes from the bottom up. In the U.S., it's a recruited force. So as you bring in new members from American youth, both at the enlisted and the officer levels, whatever they have been inculcated with through the education systems, through their societal norms and how these are changes, those are also introduced into the military. So you can see an old school officer trying to hold to traditional values and the way things occur in the military, dealing with an influx of youth that have come from a different world, a different system. So it causes problems in that way. And then the third way would be through the regular and necessary interaction of the military organizations and their officers in particular with external entities. So if you're dealing with industry, with the IT sector, with popular culture, media, recruitment, advertisements, all those sorts of things, right? You do have these intersections between what up till now has been a very conservative, traditional organization with a dramatically changed pop culture, general society sort of way. And so how do you account for that? You know, if you're trying to recruit people in, you can't be seen as something so out of step with American culture that you don't resonate with anybody, and we've had our own recruiting shortfalls over the past year or two, which have been pretty horrific and have resulted in the shrinking of America's military and the military power that it would generate. And there are consequences to that. So I think for the audience here, it's important to kind of think about the nature of military affairs, warfare, contingencies, those sorts of things. And you know, we can only look at what's occurring in Ukraine to get a mental image of that. So in those kinds of really horrific situations, things like following orders, right? Authorities, chain of command, unit cohesion. I mean, there has to be teamwork and trusted relationships between people within military units. So if I have been trained to view everything through a racial lens, through oppressed and oppressor, how does that work? I mean, it upends everything, right? So if I've got a white officer and a black staff non-commissioned officer, and the white officer says, go and do this because there's military necessity, is the black NCO supposed to view that order as being racially motivated? You know? Is the white junior enlisted guy supposed to look at the officer of color as having ascended to that position because of preferential hiring and promotion practices? Or did that individual get into a senior level because of merit and he met standards, you know, or she earned her way up as opposed to a preferential hiring or selection sort of process, right? So all of the contradictions that have been so artfully discussed this afternoon really come to bear, and whether you have integrity and coherence and cohesion within military forces. And when all that is put in doubt, because people are looking at each other through these racial lenses, or oppressed versus oppressor, or victimization, and you're responsible for where I'm at in life, those sorts of things, it just blows everything up. And so then the ultimate harm done, destruction of that body, and then the extended harm that goes into society at large, is how do we have then an effective military organization that can defend national interests or protect the country from attack. So again, just looking to Ukraine, if the people hadn't responded to that, and if the Ukrainian military hadn't had a sense of identity and mutual respect and teamwork, how in the heck should they have striven for a year to resist the Russian onslaught, right? So we're seeing some of these problems in the U.S. military, again, through the current and the previous two back administrations trying to implement a lot of these woke policies. This weird thing that, again, has already been discussed about representation of organizations to general society. Well, if that was the case, 51% of the American military would be female. But somehow we don't have that, right? When we strive for racial or ethnic representation at senior levels, those are completely out of proportion with the military body at large. I mean, the population pyramid would just have you view it in that way, right? So, and we have a merit-based system, unity of identity as a service member, whether you're a soldier or a Marine or a sailor or an airman or a space guardian, which is what we have now. Because there are standards and people put aside their ethnic or racial identities, or even their gender identity in many ways, right? As somebody meets those standards that are gender or racial neutral, they accrue the respect of those over whom they have been placed in authority. Does all that make sense? So these woke ideologies and practices, as they're imposed, again, just kind of mess with all that stuff. Identity politics, the fluidity of identity and gender. How is a military organization supposed to have any kind of normality or standards or any kind of policies of its own that allows it to do what it's expected to do? So as we see critical race theory destroying not just the fabric of our societies and pitting one group against another, and those rules seem to change at whim based on whoever can get political advantage in that, the same thing can occur in military units. There's also then the perception, at least in the United States, that in general terms, usually it's the conservative end of the political spectrum, philosophically speaking, of people that will tend to join the military. It's just the way it works out. So if the external perception of influencers like teachers and parents are shocked at what might be occurring within the military, how they influence their children coming up through school and maybe considering a military career, or somebody who's inherently conservative in their views, either because of the culture they grew up in the social setting, or the religious values, and they look at the military as being something different than that. It then exacerbates the ability to bring in young men and women to serve their country. So these kinds of influences, I've already indicated, can be both subtle as well as explicit and very aggressive. The subtle subversion that has already been talked to, as the minds of youth are shaped and influenced in their formative years, a very subtle, nuanced sort of thing. But then you can also have these punitive measures, right, where, again, a presidential administration or even Congress in the U.S., we have a giant defense bill that has to get passed every year, and it carries all sorts of policy prescriptions in that. And so if the military, remember, responding to orders and directives, doesn't carry out what it's told to do, then it can be held at fault for that. People can be punished. It can be ejected from the military. Funding cannot be provided for some necessary military program. It is important to the military's ability to secure the interests of the country and to defend the homeland. So all these things really come to bear as we think about wokism, critical race theory, and other aspects of this. So again, the final part here is what I referred to a bit earlier, and that's the left's exploitation of the coercive powers of government, or the ability of federal law to supersede or to trump local and state policies and even cultural preferences. And I'll just use as one example, when we normalized homosexuality in terms of bringing in homosexuals to service in the U.S. military, you now have same-sex couples, right? So if federal protections of them as a couple pertain, right, and are distributed across the country, well, that couple or that family unit can be deployed by order anywhere in our country and even stationed abroad. And so if there happen to be local or state policies that were in opposition to that, or even if it might cause a problem in a foreign posting, U.S. federal regulations trump all those sorts of things, right? So it's one ability where if you can't get broad-based concurrence across society through local votes and election cycles at the state and local levels, if you can grab instruments of power at the federal level, it is one way to bypass the will of the people, right? That you don't have to be concerned about 50 different systems as the U.S. is comprised of their 50 individual states. You just take a federal regulation and impose that nationwide, and it's one more way to get these things into common practice. And I'm sure everybody understands what I'm talking about. So that's really the extent of my formal remarks. I'm looking forward more to the questions and answer and the discussion. The military world can be a very bizarre sort of world, but its effectiveness does rest on uniformity, adherence and respect to orders, mutual respect and teamwork, and these influences that are brought in that the military cannot really resist or refuse to implement have a way of destroying all of that. So I'll just stop there and look forward to the remainder of the program. Thank you.
All right, and before we get to the Q&A, we'll invite up Rod Dreher, who is an American conservative writer and now a Budapest resident. So he'll be talking a bit about this, and then we'll all come up, all six of us. We'll get two more chairs, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to talk about religion and critical race theory and how it's played out in the United States. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about the scene in continental Europe to talk about it, but if it's not already happening here, it soon will be. I had a sign about what was coming back in 2015 when I gave a talk at the Christian Studies Center at the University of Virginia about Dante. The talk was standing room only. The evangelical staff and the students knew I was about to write a book about a Christian idea I call the Benedict option, and they eagerly invited me to come back to campus the next year to interview them about it. Well, a couple of months later, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, the big evangelical student organization that runs the UVA Christian Studies Center, held its annual national meeting. At that meeting, a young black female pastor gave a very angry talk advancing themes that fall under the rubric of critical race theory. On my blog, I was then writing a blog at the American Conservative magazine. On my blog, I criticized the young woman's talk, explaining how what she said about race and faith diverges from basic gospel Christianity. I thought that was the end of it. Well, a few months later, I contacted the Christian Studies Center at UVA to arrange interviews when I returned. No one responded. I tried twice more. Finally, someone on staff was very quiet and like hush-hush, told me that I was persona non grata there because of my criticism of that black pastor. Now, even though the Christian Studies Center was made up almost entirely of middle-class white evangelical students, the fact that I criticized a black speaker for critical race theory on Christian grounds was enough to make me totally radioactive. Those students didn't simply disagree with me, they thought I was evil and should be kept far away. Now, this happened 4 years before George Floyd's killing supercharged the CRT issue in America. I didn't know it at the time, but those white evangelical students were at the vanguard of the way this toxic ideology would take over large sections of the American church, not just the liberal church, the conservative church. Now, again, I'm going to focus my words on the American church scene, and I don't want to use my brief time today to talk about liberal American churches. Of course, they are totally consumed by CRT and by LGBT and every other left-wing social movement. They're also in steep decline. The liberal churches are not the future of Christianity in the United States. If Christianity has a future in my country, it will come from the various churches that are more or less conservative and hold a more or less orthodox view of the Bible. And it is among those people, those thinkers, the religious intellectuals, and their congregation that the inroads that CRT is making are so concerning, especially because these CRT advocates take advantage of cultural weaknesses within modern Christianity and within contemporary American society. All forms of critical theory function more like religions than intellectual theories. You can debate the claims of an intellectual theory, say judicial originalism or foreign policy realism. Critical theory, by contrast, inoculates itself against challenge by asserting its claims as dogmatic truths. If you question the premises of CRT, you thus demonstrate that you are a racist, which is to say, you are filled with irrational bigotry and need not be taken seriously. This is why those Christian students at UVA refused to speak to a man they had enthusiastically welcomed only months earlier. CRT is not only intellectually corrupt, as you've heard all day here by different speakers, but it is also anti-Christian. The New Testament offers an overwhelmingly powerful testimony against racism, against racial discrimination. Now, it is painfully true, it is undeniably true that throughout history, Christians have failed to treat people of different races with justice. Yet it is often ignored that racist institutions like slavery and segregation were defeated by Christians making Christian arguments, appealing to the hypocritical consciences of other Christians, calling them to repent. The abolitionists who abolished slavery in the U.S., they were Christians. They were British Christians and American Christians. It is no accident that the American Civil Rights Movement of the late 1950s and 1960s was led by black pastors using explicitly Christian principles, arguments, and language. They did not call on white Christians to abandon Christianity. To the contrary, they called on white Christians to be more faithful to Christian teaching. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian Orthodox survivor of the Gulag, said that his prison years taught him that the line between good and evil passes not between social classes, between races, or anything else, but right down the middle of every human heart. That is a profoundly Christian statement. It tells us that sin is individual, sin is our common condition, and that every one of us will be judged by God as individuals. Now, Solzhenitsyn made his remark in contrast to Marxism-Leninism, which had sent him and millions of others to the gulags as enemies of the people. Indeed, early in the Bolshevik regime, the head of the Ukrainian branch of Lenin's secret police told his agents that in carrying out the Red Terror, they were to arrest people not on the basis of criminal deeds, but rather on the basis of their identity. There is less difference than we may wish between a secret policeman carrying out the Red Terror in revolutionary Russia and a DEI commissar separating the sheep and the goats on an American university campus. Conservative Christian churches and institutions ought to be standing against the movement to divide Americans against each other on the basis of race, particularly because the black churches distinguish themselves so powerfully in leading the civil rights movement. The churches ought to be doing this, especially given that that very movement, the civil rights movement, which appealed across racial lines to our common humanity, is well within living memory. This was not abolishing slavery. There are so many people alive today who remember that movement. But more and more, we're seeing just the opposite happen. Why? Well, first, younger Christians believe uncritically in the concept of social justice. Now, to be fair, the term has long been associated with Christianity. It was invented by a 19th century Jesuit priest and has today been embraced even by young white evangelicals. In Catholic social teaching, social justice is the idea that individuals have a responsibility as Christians to work for the common good so that every one of us can live up to our dignity as creatures made in God's image. In the traditional view, social justice is about addressing structural barriers to fairness among groups in a given society. It is based in large part on Christ's teachings about the importance of mercy and compassion to the poor and the outcast. But Christian social justice is difficult to reconcile with secular ideals of social justice. One reason is that Christian social justice depends on the biblical concept of what a human being is, including the purpose for which all people were created. Now, this presumes a transcendent moral order, one proclaimed in Scripture and, depending on your confession, the authoritative teachings of the church. A just social order is one that makes it easier for people to be good. Peter Maurin, co-founder of the Catholic worker movement in the early 20th century, was a truly Christian social justice warrior. Maurin distinguished Christian social justice from the godless Marxist view. For Marxists, social justice meant an equal distribution of society's material goods. By contrast, Christian social justice sought to create conditions of unity that enabled all people, rich and poor alike, to live in solidarity and mutual charity as pilgrims on the road to unity with Christ. Now, if we wanted to live a Christian vision of social justice within a racial context, then we would try to create social conditions that would enable people of all races to live in solidarity and mutual charity. That would require us to confess that every single one of us, white, black, brown, Asian, and otherwise, every single one of us has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as Scripture teaches. It would require all of us to repent of the racial hatred that we may harbor in our hearts. It would require all of us to tear down social structures that reproduce racial hatred and replace them with social structures that reproduce solidarity and charity. Yet at the same time, we also would recognize that there is no systemic solution for sin. It was Peter Maurin who said that a good society is one that makes it easier for people to be good. But he also focused on the fact that you have to choose virtue for it to have any meaning. In the end, the Christian knows that virtue cannot be compelled. This authentically Christian vision is impossible to reconcile with the CRT vision, which projects evil onto whites and holds racial minorities to be blameless, free of original sin. So why is CRT appealing to so many Christians? It has to do with the nature of contemporary Christianity and of contemporary Western culture. In the first half of the 20th century, Western culture decisively shifted away from religion-based ethics and embraced a therapeutic model. As the late cultural critic Philip Rieff observed, the West ceased to affirm a shared code of right and wrong based in the Judeo-Christian tradition and focused instead on helping people live with their anxieties. Rieff said that religious man died and psychological man was born. In his great and prophetic 1966 book titled The Triumph of the Therapeutic, Rieff said that American Christianity had already abandoned its traditional vision and had become therapeutic, but Christians didn't realize it. Today, the truth of what Philip Rieff saw half a century ago is obvious. The sociologist of religion, Christian Smith, has identified as the de facto religion of American Christians something he calls moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD. It is a pseudo-Christianity that has taken over Christian institutions, churches, seminaries, universities, and schools, and uses the language of Christianity while denying its substance. According to Smith, MTD's tenets are simple. It teaches that God exists, and he wants us to be nice to other people and to be happy. You don't really need to pay attention to God unless you need something, says MTD. And everybody goes to heaven except really bad people like Hitler. And that's it. That's moralistic therapeutic deism. There's nothing in it about repentance, about sacrifice, or anything that contradicts the middle-class American consumerist lifestyle. Now, when he published his first book about MTD in 2005, Christian Smith said it was the de facto belief of young American Christians based on his surveys. But I recognized when I read his work that I had been raised in a conservative version of that in my 1970s childhood. So what does any of this have to do with CRT today? Popular Christianity in America has become a theological exercise in therapy. It mostly has to do with managing your feelings, not with arguments based on principles. And crucially, popular Christianity is not prepared to sacrifice or to suffer. And what's more, middle-class Christians, Catholic and Protestant alike, associate Christianity with prosperity and respectability. If they are required by their Christian faith to embrace or defend any principle that gets in the way of prosperity and respectability, they're not going to do it. I'll give you an example of something having nothing to do with race, but this also applies to race. Back in 2015, after the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, the head of the LGBT caucus in the California state legislature passed or introduced a bill that, if passed, would have taken away state funding for students who chose to use it at religious colleges, at so-called bigot colleges. That is to say, colleges that did not recognize gay equality. Now, the state of California had a grant program that would give money to poor students, impoverished students, mostly blacks and Latinos, but it was a matter of financial need. It would give them these grants that they could use at any accredited college in the state of California. If this new bill passed, it would force these colleges to either change their teaching or close down because so many of them depended on students coming using these grants. This was an existential matter for about 100, 150 small Christian colleges in California. A friend of mine was involved as a college administrator, involved in the campaign to rally Christians in California to stand up and defend the religious liberty of their colleges. He told me they went down to Orange County, which is suburban Los Angeles, and has a reputation of having lots of evangelical megachurches there, being somewhat conservative. He said they met with the pastors at each one of these big megachurches. All of the pastors said, "We're on your side." But none of the pastors would dare say it publicly. Why not? They were terrified of being called bigots and losing respectability in the community. In the end, the bill was defeated, thank God, but it was defeated, said my friend, only because the black Pentecostal pastors of South Central Los Angeles and the Latino Catholic Archbishop of Los Angeles stood up against it. If they had depended on middle-class white people, even white conservatives, they would have lost. This is why CRT is making so many inroads in the white churches in America today. Now, the middle-class evangelicals of Southern California were too afraid to speak up to defend their own institutions because they were too afraid of losing respectability. Now, their decision is perfectly understandable if one believes that maintaining social respectability and one's professional standing is more important than suffering for the gospel truth. They reason that if God wants us to be nice and God wants us to be happy, then surely he would want us to be affirming of LGBT people and supportive of their happiness. This is how cowardice and infidelity become Christian virtues. Now, the same process is happening with CRT in American Christian circles. CRT and other forms of critical theory have conquered or at least dominate elite American institutions. Media, academia, law, medicine, science, sports, and even, as you've just heard, the U.S. military. To resist its claims is to declare oneself, by your own resistance, to be a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, what have you. You can claim all you want that it's not true, that you simply want to have a real debate about it, and it won't matter. According to the tenets of CRT, the fact that you dissent from it makes you the enemy, and you should be treated accordingly, even in church. Now, there are real costs to be paid for dissenters. For one, no Christian wants to be called a racist or to be a racist. But if you get that label, it's going to follow you around. When I published my book, The Benedict Option, in 2017, two prominent woke evangelical figures, one a black ethicist and the other a white philosopher, accused me of advocating racism in the book. Their claim had absolutely no grounding at all. but it didn't matter. Among many potential readers, the fact that they accused me of being racist meant I was racist and someone to be avoided or punished. At a major public discussion of my book in New York City, a black commentator on a panel said that it was racist of me not to have included a chapter in this book mentioning the black church or focusing on the black church. Well, I explained in my response that the black church's experience didn't really fit into my thesis. And besides, if I had used it, I would have been accused of being a white man, indeed a white conservative, who culturally appropriated the black church's history for his own nefarious use. There's no way to win these arguments. This is how it goes. You either submit or you have to suffer. Most Christians in the West today are not willing to suffer in the slightest, so they conform. Part of their conformity is to show the others, the people on the left, their new allies, how loyal they are to the new ideology by being especially vigorous in denouncing their former co-religionist. This is how you get white evangelical leaders dealing with their own inner class and racial anxiety by seeking absolution through condemning all white Christians who disagree with them. The challenges CRT poses to Christianity have to be met with intelligence, with vigor, and with courage. In fact, I would say with the same intelligence, vigor, and courage that Pope St. John Paul II used when he attacked liberation theology in the 1980s. John Paul was no opponent of the poor. Rather, he understood that liberation theology was a Marxist counterfeit of Christianity's defense of the poor. Liberation theology then, like critical race theory today, redefines Christianity as a political and social program designed to create an earthly utopia by identifying certain social groups and condemning them as oppressors, identifying others and praising them as oppressed and therefore without sin, and then rearranging power relations. The Pope argued back then that all human activity must refer to the ultimate meaning of life, which is the salvation of souls. Political and social reform can and must be part of the church's work on earth, but if the work of the church is conceived as primarily political and social reform, then it is betraying the gospel. If the work of the church detracts from the truth that all men are sinners in need of repentance, forgiveness, and redemption, then it is betraying the gospel. John Paul did not deny, never denied that Christians should work to relieve the suffering of the poor. He would surely not deny, were he alive today, that Christians should work to eradicate racism. But all of this work must be accomplished within a truly Christian framework that affirms biblical truths about who man is and what is to be done to heal the brokenness that is within us all. Racism is an evil that must be resisted, but CRT does not do this. It rather institutionalizes anti-white and increasingly anti-Semitic and anti-Asian racism. It brings about other injustices as people who may be deserving of certain jobs or positions on the basis of their individual achievements are denied them solely on the basis of their race to meet a diversity quota. CRT, in that way, adds fuel to the fire of racial resentment, the very problem it pretends to solve. Moreover, CRT allows conservative white Christians who would prefer not to talk about the very real problems of racism in our country, the freedom to avoid the subject. There are plenty of conservative white Christians who listen to the insane rhetoric of CRT proponents and who understand that conversation with these people is impossible. But that leaves their own potential blindness to racial injustice unaddressed. These white conservative Christians, and I could well be among them myself, I have to consider that, will only be open to repentance if they can believe that those brother Christians calling them to repentance really care about the state of their souls and aren't simply manipulating the faith and religious categories to achieve power. In the end, Christians follow a Lord who dined with prostitutes and tax collectors and who is condemned in his own time for it. Jesus recognized the humanity of these outcasts. He did not affirm their sin, but he knew that they were more than simply the bearers of sin. The people who ultimately affirmed the murder of Jesus were those who believed that the line between good and evil passed between ethnic and religious groups. These were the people who left the wounded traveler broken on the side of the road, leaving it to the Good Samaritan considered unclean by many of the respectable people, to take pity on the traveler. Jesus' point is not that the Samaritans are good and the Levites are evil. His point is rather the opposite. It is that all of us have a duty to mercy and humanity, and that being truly human is not a matter of race, of religious confession, or social class. This was the universalist teaching that Martin Luther King proclaimed boldly to the American South, and that liberated all of us, white and black, from the chains of white supremacy. Today, far too many influential Christians turn to CRT to rearrange their prejudices, to declare white inferiority, not white supremacy, but white inferiority, and they call that progress. We must repent, and we must find the courage to stand against this evil. It does none of us any good to think of ourselves as absolved from sin because we are victims of social oppression, or we have made ourselves allies of these victims. This is a religious deception that will cost us our souls. Thank you.
So we'll welcome up the panelists and then start taking questions. Gentlemen, come on up. All right, so fire away. Maybe raise your hand, and if you have a question for a specific panelist, let us know. Or if it's a general question, we can all take turns, or I can assign them rather. I'm going to assign it to the most appropriate person. Don't be shy. Who's going to be first?
Hi, thank you. Actually wanted to ask Professor Ferretti a question, but I see he's not on the panel. But so broadly, if I can ask a question about maybe the idea that CRT doesn't necessarily aim at something. So I come from South Africa, where I think we've been a couple of years ahead. We had racial targets in society like 2003, pressed down. So broadly speaking, of like an 8992 target for basically any company. You can't list on the JSE, the stock exchange, if you don't have certain targets met and stuff like that. So I don't want to go into that, but broadly, there is a very clear goal. There's a very clear end in sight. So it wasn't about there's no tomorrow. There was very clearly this idea of we want absolute equality of outcome, and that remains the measure. In South Africa, that has meant that our main electricity provider has no engineers on the board. It has meant that where 20 years ago water and electricity was secure for everyone of all races, now, for instance, my parents in Johannesburg have about 4 hours of electricity a day. Water is in some of the richest suburbs in Africa is no longer a security, because essentially you appointed people not based on anything other than the color of their skins. So wouldn't that then essentially count, as I'm not necessarily challenging the point because I'm not read up on it, but wouldn't that essentially show that for these people there was a very clear teleology, and that was this sort of pre-scientific socialism idea that they had in the 1820s to say absolute equality or nothing else? So anyone who wants to answer that.
Well, I think, maybe Dakota, you can take to the question of, you talked a little bit in your speech about when you stop selecting for merit and you hire for other characteristics, you see a collapse in quality, and that's true in an industrial context, but also true in a military context.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and it manifests, right, in different sections of popular activities, right, what we do. So in the military standpoint, if the criticism is I don't have enough women or enough redheads or enough, pick whatever the category is, and then you direct the military to correct that inequity, the military side is going to do all they can to advertise and to elicit, participation. You've got people that go out through the forces and try to make the case for why this is such a great thing, and looking for applicants to do that. When those numbers don't come out as the objective would want, right, then you have these directives that do lower standards, right, that you change physical fitness standards so that more people pass, or you change the score it takes to become a marksman, or whatever that might be. Flight programs, can you fly an airplane? And you continue to adjust those things downward, of course, until you get the outcome. So on the good side, if you're outcomes based, you now have the representation you wanted. On the bad side is you have a completely ineffective military force. So what was the point in doing that? So it's the same thing when you have power outages and you have a lack of potable water. Okay, well, if that's the outcome you wanted, then go ahead and pursue that agenda. But we see the same thing taking place in the military. And the sad story is those outcomes are often hushed up, right? That the best possible face is put on it, because clearly diversity, equity, and inclusion makes the U.S. military stronger, full stop, with no evidence whatsoever that that's the case. But from a political policy standpoint, you've achieved the desired outcome.
And you know, Dakota, can I jump in on that? I, in my travels, given speeches about my book, Live Not by Lies, people who are either active duty or recently out of the military would come to me after the talk and say, I'm either leaving or I'm telling my children, do not enlist because it's not just anymore. And their lives could be on the line because of this. I ended up telling my own son, as a conservative, he was interested in the military. I said, I don't want you to go in under this current regime, because not only might you be in a situation where you have to choose between obeying your conscience or your commanding officer, but you might also get killed because they're not selecting anymore for on rational principles. What do you say to people who come to you or would ask you for advice? Should I or should my son go into the U.S. military right now in this time of wokeness?
So I was going to chime in if you hadn't asked that question. What is it? Shakespeare's Henry V with the St. Crispin's Day speech. You know, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. So a year ago, my son joined the Marine Corps. Much to the surprise of my wife and I, because he was just interested in other things, and for whatever reason, he decided to do that. We didn't try to force him down that path. And so we could have had the exact same concerns that you articulated. He is currently serving with an infantry battalion based out of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. We'll be deploying a year from now up to the Baltic region, right? So, golly, you look what's going on in Kaliningrad and Belarus and Ukraine and all that. There should be some concerns about these standards. And yet, I think that there is a nobility in service. And so how I'm going to turn that back to what you were talking about is the discipline of Christianity often calls for us to make hard decisions that don't have a material today outcome. There's a greater interest, right, at stake and a greater importance to that. So if we took the line that because things could be so harmed within the military that nobody should join, well, the logical conclusion is we have no military. Right? So just like a pastor at a Christian church, if you don't stand up for Christian principle, for fear of losing either congregants or, being talked about poorly in the public spaces, well, then we would have no Christian churches that meant anything. So I think there is, when youth talk to me or I talk to youth groups, I try to emphasize the importance of the work in spite of the political turmoil we have, and that they can make a difference themselves in improving their own lot and the lot of the unit they're with.
Can I very briefly address the gentleman about South Africa? I recently read a piece talking about the sort of things you mentioned about how bad things were in South Africa. I read pretty widely in the American media. I had no idea, because it's not being talked about. When South Africa was under the apartheid government, it was constantly in the news. But now it's not in the news because it doesn't fit the narrative. And this makes me think about how after 30 years in the media, when I was in mainstream newsrooms, I saw people deliberately making choices, newsroom leaders, making choices to ignore certain facts that were inconvenient to a left-wing narrative. And some conservatives in America think that media bias expresses itself by the liberal media telling you what to believe. That's not really it. It expresses itself more subtly than that by telling people what they should be thinking about, by framing things within the bounds of discussion. And we, by now, I think, and after the summer of Floyd and after the whole COVID debacle, I think a sufficient number of Americans now realize that their media do not tell them the truth. The media do not tell them, as a general rule, things that go against the preferred narrative inside newsrooms. And I think this is terrible for democracy. It really is. I mean, I went into journalism myself because I thought that I thought journalism was fun, but I also thought and believed it played a vital role in a healthy democracy, and a democracy that was self-critical. That's no longer the case.
Great. Let's move on to another question, and then perhaps we can include the rest here in the front.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rufo. My name is Bela Gedeon, Foreign Policy Editor at the Hungarian news agency MTI, also former diplomat working at the Embassy of Hungary in Washington, D.C. during the Trump administration as a press attaché. Much fun, based on the coverage of Hungary and the U.S. media. My question is directed particularly to the U.S. participants or the American participants in the panel. And the question is, can you speculate or can you give any prognosis on the future of CRT and also woke movement in the United States in light of the potential developments of the 2024 presidential campaign? Particularly, do you see any factual differences or potentially any differences in a potential Trump White House or in a potential DeSantis White House? Of course, Donald Trump was vocal and clear, denying and attacking any fake news provocations, but also Governor DeSantis is very much confrontational against teaching of any alternative history or wokism in Florida state schools, and also he has been active in attacking any problems, as one of the presenters here mentioned, wokism and CRT in sports. There was one particular instance when Governor DeSantis gave an alternative first prize to a swimmer who was only second in the competition when a former male swimmer turned into a female swimmer and was declared in the competition just because he had a background from male swimming. So do you see any potential differences in these potential situations in a Trump White House and the DeSantis White House after 2024? Thank you very much.
Softball pitch across.
I guess, yeah, that would be more for me. So, look, in 2020, I worked with the Trump administration on the original CRT ban that was based on the reporting that I had done and an appearance I had on Fox News. I've worked very closely with the DeSantis administration in Florida on the same set of issues: critical race theory, gender ideology, education policy, also higher education. And I would say this, trying to be diplomatic between the two camps. I recently held a summit with folks from many different political camps within the conservative movement, and at the staff level, the policy level, the administrative level, I'm hoping that what we'll see is an almost ecumenical council where all of the major conservative and Republican candidates, they're going to have to be anti-woke. That's a critical part of the conservative movement, the conservative platform. I think it's a big vulnerability for the Biden administration, so whoever goes up against President Biden in the general election could use that as an advantage. And I think that, in my mind, personally, speaking only on my own behalf, I think both Trump and DeSantis will be aggressively anti-woke. I think the policies are going to be there. I think the ideas are going to be very strong, and it's up to Republican primary voters to decide who is going to be most effective in executing that set of policy priorities. I have my own support. I clearly aligned, but I think to me that is the important question: is how can we operationalize this? How can we turn this into a concrete agenda? And how can we take this public opposition that, if you look at it issue by issue, is very strong, and turn it into public policy? That's going to be the key question for me. I think that the evidence suggests Governor DeSantis would be a better operator, better able to operationalize it. But ultimately, it's not up to me. It's up to the X million Republican primary voters.
Real quick,
Yeah.
I don't have to be diplomatic. I think wokeness is which I call soft totalitarianism, is the greatest threat to the United States and even to Western civilization. Frank Ferretti said when he was earlier, it's a greater threat than communism, and I think he's right. So I'm going to vote for the conservative nominee in 2024 no matter what. But I think that Ron DeSantis is a clearly better because he has the focus and the political skills to make substantive decisions. Donald Trump had 4 years. He didn't do a whole lot. He had to face, on the wokeness question, he had to face a lot of opposition, but we know what he's capable of and what he's not capable of in office. I think also that wokeness accelerated when Trump was in the White House because the left lost its mind. I think if Trump comes back to the White House, we are going to see a wokeness get even more aggressive because the left will have lost its mind. I think Governor DeSantis, by contrast, because he's not a dramatic guy, he has the capacity to deal with these issues without enshrouding them with inflammatory rhetoric and making it a personal matter. I think we can see a lot more actual and substantive things get done against wokeness under DeSantis' presidency. The question is, will Republican voters be mature enough to actually want to reward deeds over rhetoric?
Yeah, I think that's
Can I have
very
one-
well said. Yeah.
one thing. So just stepping aside from who wins the presidency, I think that this analogy of wokeness as a virus continues in this vein, right? So what is the longevity of wokeness in spite of all the damage it can do? Just like a virus in the body. If it is too virulent, it kills the patient, and then it can't be spread to the next patient, right? So what you're seeing across America is just some disgusted, average Americans that are stepping forward. In Loudoun County, which is a very influential county in Virginia, parents taking on school boards for the woke agenda being imposed in grade school, the youngest grades on up. The fact that you have biological men identifying as women competing in college athletics and winning because they have biological advantages to that is just outraging people. So I do think that in the 18 months, 2 years ahead, regardless whoever the Republican nominee is, I think they will find a groundswell of support to combat this sort of stuff just because of the egregious overreach of this wokism and its adherents.
And the big question, maybe just briefly before we move on to the next audience member, is the other big problem is that because it's an ideology that imposes itself anti-democratically, we have an open question on, well, how do you deal with it through the legislative action, through executive action? And on that question, too, I think I very much agree with Rod that Governor DeSantis has shown much more strategic vision, much more follow-through, much more kind of execution savvy. And so I think that he would be able to recruit the right staff, recruit the right appointees into his administration, and start to actually shift power. And I know the times that I've spent with the governor and the discussions I've had, I've been pretty actually amazed by his ability to use a sports analogy, to see the whole playing field. He knows how power works. He knows what levers the legislature can pull. He knows how to use the power of appointments. He knows how to go at the media without having a jujitsu effect where his attacks yield a stronger counterattack. And I think that, perhaps, though, the temptation from Republican primary voters is if we get Trump, everything is going to melt down. And won't that be kind of an interesting mushroom cloud of woke apocalypse? I mean, it'd be a spectacular event. And so there also is that possibility. And I think maybe we could just export it to France and the Netherlands and let them deal with it. But I think it's going to be a central theme in the 2024.
Hello, I wanted to thank all of the panelists for the very wonderful presentations that everyone has made. I am currently a bachelor student at ELTA studying international relations. And if it was possible, I wanted to ask at least 2 questions regarding the presentation. And I wanted to divert my question to the more European effects of critical race theory had within Europe. First of all the French speaker had spoken about how wokeness, in fact, the new woke youth movement had had in fact sidelined the old left, and how they had been more or less been birthed from the old left, and now they're beginning to destroy their fathers and being able to replace them in the near future. Do you think that in order to defeat wokeness, that the old left needs to be more, well, revitalized in a way in order to not be replaced by a more radical and more militant woke movement? And along with that, I wanted to ask regarding the military. Do you think that the military needs to be apolitical in order for it to be a meritocratic institution that can combat and ensure safety within the world? And you've also mentioned that the military itself often recruits from young conservatives. So with the military occasionally branding itself towards more diverse recruits, do you think that would eventually balance itself out? Or should the military constantly strive for apoliticalness and separating itself from politics, or more towards meritocracy and making sure it gets the most loyal and the most compliant recruits for its ranks?
Okay, let's take the first one. We'll go to Pierre and then Diederik on the first question.
Is working. Yeah. On the French left, I've been thinking about this for a lot, because as I alluded to in the speech, it is a mystery. If you put side by side what the French left has believed in for centuries, I said it's practically older than America, and you put what wokeness claims today, you have a series of not minor incompatibilities, but major incompatibilities, betrayals of the highest proportion. And so if you only put these, say, contradictions side by side, then you are effectively at a loss in explaining how this replacement took place. Because you can just see, well, they were for rationalism, universalism, laïcité, scientific method, the republic, and then you just go one by one, and okay, that's white, that's white, that's white, that's white, so out, basically.
Great replacement.
And you just look at it this way, and you can't explain it. So my attempt, and this is what I've been working on for an upcoming book, is to try and see, okay, so that's what didn't continue, but perhaps there are continuities between the two different lefts, which could explain why there was a lack of antibodies in the old left. And I alluded to one in the speech, which was the question of novelty and youth. So if you say everything that's new is better, and if you say everything which comes from the youth is true, then when you have a new youth coming along and saying, okay, boomer, what can you respond? And the old 68 left that we have in France from the 60s, which was 20 years old in the 60s and about 70, 80 today, they had a slogan which they yelled out, which was Papa pue, which in translation means Daddy stinks. So they had their own OK Boomer. So when you have a young generation which says OK Boomer, they basically copied them. And so you get this really weird situation with fathers which don't recognize their sons, and sons which don't recognize their fathers, or perhaps their great-grandfathers, and yet that's in itself the proof that they are, in fact, linked by inheritance. So in a very, say, peculiar sense, the young generation has inherited a refusal of inheritance. I think that's the way I'd phrase it. They've inherited a refusal of tradition. And you get this really weird tension that you see in American wokeness as well, of the relationship between the young and the old, where you have, I guess, a desire to place yourself, when you are young woke, in the footsteps of, say, Martin Luther King, whilst also at the same time, and this is the interest convergence thesis of critical race theory, saying that actually Martin Luther King didn't do anything because now racism is much worse than it was before because it's more discreet and pervasive. However, go Martin Luther King. And also, oh, and by the way, his universalist way of thinking was actually far-right racism in disguise, which is basically Ibram X. Kendi's whole shtick. And so there's this weird thing where, oh, the guys before us, they were old and wrong, and I like Martin Luther King though, but he did nothing, and so this really weird way of showing the fact that the left has a real problem thinking the notion of filiation, the notion of inheritance, the notion of continuity, because continuity is, say, complicity in racism. And so there's no real good way around that, and I think it's a real problem. And when you said about working with the left, I've got no problem with that, as long as I said, they become less sectarian in their way of thinking. And if they're willing to work, then that's fine. As I said, I've worked with many people on the left, and the l'Observatoire du décolonialisme is extraordinarily brave and mostly left-leaning. So these people exist. However, they're looking like the ice around them is melting. So I think we have to help them. But I mean, the debate isn't over, but it's going badly. That's how I'd phrase it.
Deirdre, how about you? Would you like to?
Sure. Yes. Thanks very much. I think that's very true. The refusal to inherit is an important part of this. And I think I'm nostalgic for the old left. I'm growing more and more fond of the old left as I grow older. Because, okay, yeah, they wanted welfare, systems. They wanted high welfare payouts and stuff. But all that discussion seemed to be sort of became less relevant. It almost seems irrelevant now because it was also adopted by everyone else. It became sort of incorporated into the whole society. Everyone agreed with it now. You have some kind of welfare system. So I think in some sense what they were looking for is just this whole thing, this new woke critical race theory became the only show in town. So you're right, young people are looking for a show. They want something. So many revolutionary organizations are also somewhat narcissistic. You want to feel like a rebel. You want to feel revolutionary. This is also why I think it's part of what explains why they don't necessarily have a specific goal they want to achieve, because the goal is to feel like a rebel. And so it was the only show in town, and there are continuities with the older left as well, as because part of the old left was also to some extent inspired by this. It was resentful towards the old conservative Western tradition, and it maybe it shows us that the impulse of that part of the impulse of the old left even was always to repudiate and to resist and to find something new. And now, once that was no longer available, they just started looking for something else. In fact, the Socialist Party in the Netherlands is split over this. So the young socialists, they wanted to become woke, and they were going all the way with, whereas the old socialists, actually the young socialists were kicked out of their party because they embraced this woke ideology, and the older socialists saying, no, it's about class, it's about economical class, we don't want to go this way. And so they actually, the whole party split. Unfortunately, the Social Democrats, who could have been our allies to some extent, are now merging, at least in the Netherlands, with the Greens. So everyone is just going in the woke direction because they think, well, we want to be revolutionaries, and this is the way to be it.
One thing that worries me about the future of all of our countries is if the old-fashioned liberal institutions, classically liberal institutions like political parties and churches fail. And I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. One thing I'm hearing more and more from the U.S. Is that young people are moving into paganism. Young white people moving into an explicitly race-based paganism. And it's we can see the polls and surveys showing that American young people are leaving Christianity, but that doesn't mean they're becoming atheists. Many of them aren't. Some of them are becoming New Age occultists, but some are becoming explicitly pagan, joining a white supremacist pagan. And they're doing this because they have not seen the churches stand up to this racism under the guise of CRT. And this is in a similar way, I'm thinking about something that a reporter for a major American newspaper told me here in Budapest a couple of years ago. I asked her why her newspaper had gone woke and abandoned its long tradition of having good standards. It was a liberal paper, but it was always respectable and tried to be fair. And she said that it happened because of Trump, that so many people in the newsroom, especially young people, decided that if being fair got us Donald Trump, then there's no point in being fair anymore. We have to just throw liberal, classical liberal standards of fairness aside. I have a feeling that if wokeness goes on even further, that we're going to see a similar radicalization on the right in America. They'll feel like, what's the point of electing Republicans if none of this ever stops? And the same way they'll lose faith in conventional Christian leaders, they'll lose faith in conventional conservative leaders.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one thing to the question of the left being taken over. One example which really struck me, again in France, was that when my first work came out in July 2021, I was lucky to get a pretty wide press coverage, and there were only 3, I'd say, print papers that didn't cover my work. And the worst thing is I had contacts in these print presses. And I talked to many journalists, and they're like, yeah, it's interesting. I know we should talk about it. It's nice. I'll try and bring it up in the newsroom, and I'll try it. And not a single one of these 3, which I have in mind, passed. Not a single one of them managed to talk about it. And I was like, okay, that's in itself interesting, because I was speaking to people who were convinced individually, but in an environment where the subject, as they told me in a hush-hush voice, like, oh, it's a bit tricky on the inside right now. In the newsroom, some of the young guys are quite radical. My job could be on the line and whatever. And there was an article which came out a few months after this by Le Figaro, which was filled with testimony by different journalists, anonymously, obviously, in these big institutions, because they're huge institutions, who basically said, now this young generation has arrived. Now we don't say anything. I don't bring up certain subjects at all in the newsroom. I talked about the illustrator, which left Le Monde and went to a center-right newspaper. And I thought that was a very telling moment, because that was only a few years after the entire left and the entire country was in the streets in 2015 saying, yes, I am Charlie Hebdo. We are for, satirical point of views. We are for this kind of left. We are for Voltaire and everything. And you could just see this shift going on where, one by one, these big institutions from the old left were just shutting down on these subjects. And we had Le Monde magazine, for instance, which had a full-blown cover on basically the French equivalent of Black Lives Matter. And so you could see this sort of centrist, tie-wearing, serious journalists who were just incapable of resisting this thing. And that really, took my attention. That's why I wanted to focus on why.
Sure. Should we go? Yeah, let's...
Whatever you want.
Yeah, why don't we go to the second question briefly?
Yeah, so just real quick, the military doesn't operate in a vacuum or isolated. You have former military veterans, you've got the retired community, you have members in Congress. Our congressional legislative side is split 50-50, basically. So the Republicans now control the House by a slim margin, very close by 1 vote, I think, in the Senate. And so during periods of legislative activity, they can introduce pieces of legislation, or they can hold hearings and those sorts of things. So if we do see a shift in 2024, and a Republican administration takes the White House on that, a lot of these woke appointments, the policy edicts and those sorts of things will go away. So the top-down component to that will go away. When legislation is passed between the 2 houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, they have to reach accommodation on that. So I think there is a strong potential in 2024, 2025 for a lot of the current damages to be lessened or mitigated. Long-term consequences yet to be seen, right? But this military stuff, or all the technology involved, is a very human, analog, emotional sort of experience or world. And so the people involved certainly have the ability to correct some of these things in the next election cycle.
Great. And I think there was a gentleman in the back who's had his hand up for a while. I should get to him.
Hi, my name is Tio. in the interest of full disclosure, I had requested give 5 minutes. I was given 2 minutes. I'll give up my 2 minutes for a question or two. Number one question about the white supremacy part. You went over it very fast. After I finish, if you can explain a little bit about what you mean, pagan and white supremacy. I like to refer to the elephant in the room. I was preempted, and that's Donald Trump. Why the elephant in the room? Because before the elections of 2016, I had no idea about the CRT, and I'm a conservative. Him coming to power brought up to the surface the CRT without any doubt. While it is very true what you're saying about DeSantis being a better possibility, I agree. From point of view that the meltdown, if Trump wins again, may be a catastrophe. My point is different. How do we solve the problem of split families? I'm a clear case. My son is a progressive teacher in New York. He refused to talk to me after Trump was elected. He asked me, hey, Dad, you still have the Canadian passport? No, I want to move to Canada. I want to go back to the families because this wasn't really covered. So due to the election of Trump, families were split. Fact. Let's say that is passed because now Trump is where he is. There will be elections. He may start again. But it looks to me that the CRT does more or less the same thing. My son tried to convert me. He sent me, look at the movie 13. That's a movie that I should watch. It's called 13, very simple. That shows how bad was America and how racist we were. I was born in a communist country. I had friends, black, white, green, whatever. As a Jew, I had Arab friends up to here. I still have them today. I have Palestinian friends being an Israeli. So don't call me a racist. My son called me a racist for no reason whatsoever. The point I want to make, how do you handle this? I can't talk to him. And I'm sure the other people here, if you have a child that's into this, end result, no children. We don't want to change our lifestyle, which is another result of the woke. The woke part and the Marxist part, we know, has one of the scopes, the destruction of family structure, generational wealth. You guys know the list. I don't have to say it. So how do you see this problem of split families? What can you do? Put Trump aside. I want to get into that. The CRT. What do you do when you have children or family members? They say, hey, we were racist. Yeah, I'm the one beating up the blacks, right? What do you want from me? So, first of all, the white supremacy. Second, about family splits because of the woke and the CRT. Thank you.
Briefly about white supremacists and paganism. There's a branch of paganism in the U.S. based on Norse paganism and on white supremacy, on whites as being the superior race. It's anti-Semitic. It's obviously anti-black. And I don't know how widespread it is, but I'm told by friends who study religion in America that this is starting to attract a lot of young men into it, of angry white young men, and they're melding it with this religious commitment, explicitly anti-Christian religious commitment, because they believe Christianity is weakness, and they look at woke pastors as an example of its weakness. Clearly, I don't support them at all, but I worry that if Christian pastors don't start becoming more realistic about this, we're going to lose more to that. On the question of families, it's a really interesting question that Southerners of my generation, I'm from the Deep South, we had to face this with our parents' generation. And my father and I, my late father and I, we ended up making a deal not to talk about it, because he had views, racial views that were greatly at odds with my own. And we realized that if we loved each other so much that we didn't want there to be this constant fighting about it. He believed I was wrong, I believed he was wrong, and we just simply wouldn't talk about it. So many Southerners of my generation who disagreed with the racial views of our parents, the segregationist views of our parents. This was a compromise that we were happy to make. But as you say, the woke won't let you do that. They demand that you attack your parents. I'm unwilling to do that, and I will I don't think my parents are right about race, but they're my parents, and I love them. And the views I have, the love I have for my family is much more important to me than politics. And I'm glad they feel the same way. We were able to maintain a relationship that way, but now the left is demanding or saying that children should behave as your son has. And I'm very sorry to hear that. My son was on the left too, but thank God he believes in the primacy of family relations.
I think Deirdre had something too.
Yes, about white supremacy and paganism. You were bringing it up as well. Yeah, I think this is a very worrying but true thing that we have been seeing as well in the Netherlands. So there's this whole new party, and there's this whole youth culture that is growing up that has some links, seem to have some links to it. I've seen what they write about in this new magazine. They talk about Nietzsche's and the natural rule of the strong or of the weak. They talk about René Guénon, the French writer who converted to Islam, because they even mentioned Julius Evola, who thought that Christianity is like a Semitic superstition, as the way he referred to it. And I think it's true that it's just partly caused by, Christianity's been on the decline for decades now. Young people are not necessarily brought up in Christianity, but also if you are worried about mass migration or worried about where society's heading, you're going to look for an identity. Now, religion literally means obviously binding. So what is going to bind society if it isn't Christianity? And especially if then you have this critical race theory and race, everything is suddenly about race. Well, you can expect a reactionary backlash where at some point the white people are going to say, well, wait a minute, then we're also a race. And then we're also going to take that as a prime determinant of our identity. And this is extremely, extremely worrying. But it is exacerbated also by if people see the churches, and the churches, instead of, they're blaming you for opposing mass migration. They're absorbing this language of, to an extent, even critical race theory. They're absorbing this idea that you have to apologize for all these things, that the whole language is absorbed by it. Then yes, people will at some point going to say, well then, and if you keep telling people, you're racist because of this, you're racist because at some point, people are going to say, well, you know what? Yes, okay, so I am a racist. What are you going to do? I think this is extremely worrying, but it is visible, and it may get worse.
Well, along those lines, I want to ask you two Europeans. A few years ago, I had a German reader of my blog who wrote to me and said, I hate Christians, even though I'm a Christian. He said, I hate Christians, not because I don't believe, though I'm not a believer. I hate Christians because the churches, Protestant and Catholic in my country, are constantly advocating to open the borders up, and they're destroying my country. So this guy had become anti-Christian because of the actions, the political actions of the Christian leadership. Is this something that's a real threat in Europe?
I was going to say, the way I see it as of now, there are 3 and possibly only 3 options in France and most of the Western world in general, which is, I was going to say on the one hand, but there's 3 options, and we don't have 3 hands.
Not yet.
Not yet.
We're non-binary. We can do that.
That was to be expected, I guess. So one option is a sort of pre-modern right-wing paganism, which we've been talking about, and I think Nietzsche has a real role in that, in the way they read him, at least. Then there's the sort of postmodern left-wing wokeness, and then there's this different option, which was called Christianity not so long ago. And I think that I'll merge together 2 expressions which seem contradictory, but which actually are not, which is C.S. Lewis, who talked about Christianity with water, which is a way of saying a diluted down Christianity, which was what I think Rod was talking about in his speech. And then there's another thing which Aldous Huxley talked about, which was Christianity without tears. And paradoxically, Christianity without tears and Christianity with water turns out to be one and the same thing, which is a sort of humanitarian religion we're going through. And I think it's that version of the faith which has been presented and sold to the youth. And they, of course, don't distinguish it from wokeness in the sort of the relationship with weakness and the other with a capital O. They read this kind of attention to the Good Samaritan and the prostitute as a perversion, as a weakness. And it seems to me that in these three options, one of them is a love of weakness for itself, which is this sort of weird victimhood culture we see, which has so many paradoxical results. I'm more victim than you, I'm worse off than you, this whole narratives of suffering that we read at universities. And then there's, and in fact, a right-wing commentator in France wrote a book called This Way, a sort of love of strength in itself, a love of, a domination of power. And that seems great. And then there's this intermediary option, which seems to take away the risks of both and join them together, which is love of strength on behalf of the weak. And I think that's the Christian message, is to say, you have to have a sword, but you have to use it to protect the widow and the orphan. And I think we've offered a Christianity without a sword, which, of course, especially for young men, is not, a way of selling it to them. They need chivalry, but chivalry is strength, not weakness, strength on behalf of the weak within our societies. And I think that middle line is the one we have to walk. And Christianity without water, with water, or without tears is not an option that's going to cut it.
All right, let's take another one here in the front.
Hello. Mr. Dreher gave a... Oh, okay. Hello. My name is Shade Roop. I'm a former American. I became a Hungarian citizen to escape the bonds of what's happening in America lately. And it sounds like a lot of what's happening and happened to America has actually not really reached a lot of European ears, which is interesting to me. I've gone and heard God Sod. Is that name known to our panelists? Okay, over at Corvinus. A man named Peter Boghossian. I don't know. Okay, so a little bit. But recently, during a 15-minute talk, just in his first minute, Rod brought up that 90% of what is told to Americans are just lies about Hungary. And even further with Mr. Boghossian, he and two other professors wrote a number of papers in America that were complete bullshit, but they were written in woke and they were published. And one of them, they even took Mein Kampf and rewrote it using feminist language, and it was published.
Yeah, it was a hoax, to make me clear. They were trying to show how empty wokeness is.
Yeah, and I mean, it was really remarkable. They also did one saying that men could overcome transphobia by inserting sex toys in their anus, and this was published. So what we're basically seeing is that if you're logical and you discuss history, you discuss French history, you discuss Christian history, you're Satan, you're Hitler, you're bad. But if you use all this woke terminology, then you're good. And also what Rod mentioned in this piece is that it's very easy to make fun of this craziness, but we need to move past this and really join up together. He's mentioned turning Budapest into an intellectual center for discussion. And as a former American who's traveled a lot, for me, I need to do more than just visit or drive through a state. I need to spend a night. And in 2020, I visited Seattle and drove back through America. And I talked to people, I took pictures, and it was very interesting because I drove through 13 states over 8 nights. And all throughout those states, I saw Trump signs, Trump hats, Trump t-shirts, Trump bumper stickers, and only one mentioned Biden. I saw one Biden sign. Yet he won the election. Is the question too long? Oh, I'm just wondering. So I'm wondering what actions are being taken now to have a more cohesive discussion and something that'll go past merely pointing out what's happening. I think, I mean, obviously, I mean, Rod mentioned this in the interview, like, what can we do to get past just the finger pointing or going, look at what they're doing now? You know, what discussions are you guys seeing where we're going to move past this and into something much more cohesive?
I think a few things. First of all, you know, if you have a gunshot wound victim shows up in the ER, the first thing you want to stop the bleeding. And so some of the anti-CRT legislation, some of the legislation saying, hey, no gender theory in primary school, those are the immediate fixes to try to box in or restrict some of the transmission of the ideology. That's step one. Step two, and this is already happening in many American states, legislators are passing legislation. For example, what is called universal school choice, saying to parents, hey, if you're unhappy with the curriculum in your child's elementary school or middle school or high school, you can take your education dollars, $7,000, $8,000 a year per child, and take them to any institution of your choice, private school, religious school, homeschool, alternative school. That's now, I think, in 5 or 6 states, with Florida coming in today with a kind of an alternative program that I think will get there to the universal voucher, essentially. That's creating an economic incentive to create alternatives. And that's really the third point that has to happen. We have to create alternative institutions. And so you can defund, ban, restrict the government public institutions that exist to try to kind of stop the flow of these poisonous ideas. Second, you can start to break up the cartel-like structures of many of the existing systems, giving money, resources, and power to people in a decentralized manner. And then third, hopefully that will stimulate demand for alternatives. And classical education is something that is growing at a kind of geometric rate. A lot of the Catholic schools in the United States have adopted a more conservative stance. You now have a few hundred of them that are explicitly providing an antidote to some of this woke ideology. And then I think as we move up the chain, we're going to see alternatives starting to develop. And ultimately, you know, you have to operate on all of the various levels: the direct public level, the decentralization of resources, and then, you know, private and public alternatives. And the question is, will it be enough? Will it happen at the fast enough speed? Will we have leadership that is willing to put significant resources into alternatives? I'm optimistic by nature. I think that, yes, we will. But in blue states, probably not. So you're going to see a real competition between different institutions of different states happening in coming years.
Well, I want to say that I think Governor DeSantis has been extraordinary on this point, because when he, let me back up, extraordinary in ways that you didn't see conservative governors be before. In 2015, when the state of Indiana passed a state version of the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a very mild law, a coalition of big woke capitalists led by Apple Computers, Salesforce, and others came down like a ton of bricks on the state and said, if you don't repeal this bigot law, there will be economic consequences. This was the first time that major corporations had involved themselves in the culture war, and it was a total rout. Governor Mike Pence and the Republican legislature did what big business wanted. They were craven. You had fast forward to Ron DeSantis, who picked a fight in Florida with Walt Disney. Or rather, Disney tried to pick a fight with him, and he punched back hard. This is extraordinary. The media labeled it a don't say gay law. It turns out that according to a poll, an independent poll taken, 53% of Joe Biden voters nationwide supported Governor DeSantis. The fact is, Governor DeSantis called their bluff. He was not intimidated by it. Just today, I saw that in the state of Kentucky, the Republican legislature passed a series of a legislative package that would roll back transgenderism in schools and among children. It said that you cannot inject children with hormones or do surgical interventions, among other things. It was vetoed by the state's Democratic governor, who gave the typical left-wing, there's going to be bullying, there's suicides, they don't care, etc. I think Republicans have finally learned now that this is nonsense. It's just rhetorical bullying, and to stick by what you've done. It's a veto-proof majority, by the way, so this will happen in Kentucky. I think that what Governor DeSantis has done, though, is show that if you are not intimidated by what the media say and by what the activists say, that you can actually succeed and push it back on this stuff, because it's not broadly popular. It's just that so many people have never seen any Republicans or any conservative leaders take a chance to push back because they've been so afraid.
Well, I just wanted to ask one question about the dangerous intersection of two trends, and partly it's prompted by Mr. Valentin's reference to the beheading in France. It seems to me we've created multinationals, multi-ethnic societies without a corresponding unifying national identity, particularly for young people, and that's one thing. And the other trend is we do not seem to be responding effectively to the cultivation of hatred, particularly hatred of the whites, but increasingly too of Asians and of other white adjacent people. And I completely understand that this corresponds to some of the cultivation of hatred of black people that occurred in the past in America, and that's not something we can forget. But if you take the first trend, we haven't created a unifying national identity for young people, at least in some societies, certainly Britain. And the second one, the cultivation of hatred of other groups. Isn't that the single most important aspect of our debate today?
You want to take it? You were invoked. Yeah.
I was summoned. Yeah, I think on the question of the beheading, in France, these two subjects are really tightly intertwined. The left, which criticizes political Islam, is the same one which criticizes wokism. There's no such thing as like some of them being brave on one subject and not on the other. Like once you're in, you're in. And I know that France is doing a better job than, say, Belgium on these questions. In Belgium, it's crazy. The European institutions are unbelievably, say, connected with political Islam on many levels. A lot of funding going on, and clearly the lack of a unifying narrative will pursue this fragmentation, where you have these young kids, especially on the internet, who find a community. And this is where I think there's a big distinction to be made between the different kinds of communities, because in the, say, Catholic social doctrine, the conception we have of community is one which functions through the notion of subsidiarity. So what you have is every local community which together binds to form one larger community. So you have your family, you have your area, and then you go one step up, your region, and then you go up to your nation. And what does wokism do? It creates communities that are whose definition is to be against the wider community. So your local LGBT community is bound together against the system, the heterosexual system. Your local black community is bound together because it's against white supremacy in the white system. So you bind micro-communities against, so negatively, by negation, against the wider national community. So there's this way of recreating community when community was no longer offered to them. So this is why I said in the speech, unity will return, but either with or against us. And it seems to me that we have to frame the debate in this way, to say, these are the two options. There is no third way. It's community either for or against us. And I think that's something we have to push forth.
I should say quickly, John, that I think that you're right. This is one of the fundamental political problems of our age. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, in his great book After Virtue from the early 1980s, said that, talked about the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West coming at a time when people ceased to believe in the functions of empire. And he said that we are living through the similar position today in the West, that people no longer have faith in what this civilization has stood for, and that we are going to decline and disperse because we lack that unifying vision. And there are other critics, too, have talked about how Christianity in all its various forms, despite all the intra-Christian arguing, the religion of Christianity, or more broadly speaking, the religion of the Bible, gave the West something to hold it together. The fact that we don't have a shared religion anymore, I guess wokeness is trying to present itself as a pseudo-religion, but the fact that we don't have a shared religion does not bode well for keeping things together. Maybe laïcité in France, a negative religion, could be a form of solidarity, but Islam blows that apart.
Great. Okay, let's take you and then Mao afterwards the second one. Okay, great. We'll do 1 and 2, and then I think we'll wrap up for the day.
Hi, Wael Tajimilla, Danube Institute. Thanks so much for this fantastic presentation. I would like to bounce off our very own dear John O'Sullivan's question with a further sort of conceptual proposition here as a way to think about wokeness. So Peter Turchin, the historian, in his 2010 paper, War, Space, and the Evolution of Old World Societies, introduces this concept of the ethnic mafia. And it's kind of an unpleasant word, but I think actually it can be applied to wokeness quite neatly. I'll explain what I mean with an example. So in ancient Rome, what happened was that as the state expanded, it began to encompass different ethnicities, some of whom were not treated very fairly, and historical grievances accumulated. Eventually, you had the Etruscans, the Lugians, the Rugians, the Hellenes from southern Italy, all demanding places in the military. They also didn't like this concept of inheritance because they had nothing to inherit. The Romans were the only ones inheriting. So in this case, this ethnic mafia, which was in reality a sort of multi-ethnic coalitionary mafia, banded together and actually fought a full war against the Romans, which was called the Social War. Socii in Latin, of course, means allies. And it seems to me that in the United States right now, we went from black servicemen, fighting and dying alongside their white compatriots against the colonial imperialistic ambitions of the Japanese Empire. And their grandsons are now saying, well, we want monoclonal antibodies for us during COVID, but white people shouldn't be allowed to get it. That's actually something that happened in Texas, of all places, during the pandemic. So if it's true that this kind of an idea or concept of the ethnic mafia is this sort of multi-ethnic or even gender-based coalition of people who are resentful and want more is true, what might the solution be, and does it necessarily need to result in the same kind of catastrophe that happened in Rome with the social war?
Yes. Well, I hope not. But I think there is, and it's crucial to find some kind of unifying narrative to make people feel part of something. Because what I see is also many people who are children of migrants, who are disgruntled, who are angry, or maybe vulnerable to this kind of victimhood narrative. They're also looking for solidarity. There's they really want to be part of something, but it's just not supplied because the prevailing dominant narrative that is presented to them is this: okay, we are not really a country, because the idea of nationhood itself has also been repudiated. So the country, maybe not so much in the United States, but our country is not a neutral piece of real estate with some individuals brandishing rights, but you're a historically grown cultural community. So what we need, I think, is a politics of home. There have been forms of patriotism and nationalism that have been great unifying forces. After the fall of the Roman Empire, that wasn't the case, because then you had Christianity became kind of the new identity. All these old tribes that were disappearing and dying, they could find a new identity as Christians. But later on, the great movements, you've seen different kinds of peoples come together in a kind of patriotism. You get a new identity as a national community, as a home, and I think that's still an important part of a unifying narrative that we need. We need a politics of home.
Janet Karakash. I'm working on a more pessimistic vein, which is, okay, someone referred to the new synthetic revolutionary classes. I'm suggesting, maybe, that they don't have any actual desire to govern. It's like sitting in the back seat or the cheap seats, and ruling is a hassle. Being in government is a hassle. Having parliament and so on, it's a hassle. If you can get what you want without governing, why bother with? It seems to me they're being extremely successful without that. So that's one comment, question. The other, critical race theory is really North America and Europe based, where color has met white. More or less, it's a little more complicated in North America, but okay, I think it's understood. Which leaves most of the rest of the world not confronting this issue in any way, shape, or form, which leaves over 1 billion in China, over 1 billion in India, God knows how many over 1 billion in Africa, that are absolutely racially homogenous. And the notion of critical race theory is a non-subject for very obvious reasons. So I'm wondering, the proponents of critical race theory and its popularity and its drive, how do they place this within the larger world, which at least 2/3 of the world? No audience there, no, or what can it be? Because if at least 2/3 of the world can't engage with critical race theory, this kind of universalist message, and that's how it's being purported, and I agree with that, except that it doesn't apply to 2/3 of the world's population, but it's being purported as such.
Sure, yeah, maybe I'll start. And I think there's two answers. I mean, one answer is that they're very parochial for all of their supposed cosmopolitanism and taking a larger view of the world. In fact, they're all, at a personal level, very parochial. For them, the world is, you know, the Acela train between Washington, D.C. and New York, and maybe up to Boston for the Harvard campus. For them, that is the world. I mean, that is where they want to have position, status, approval, relationships. And so, you know, it'd be very inconvenient to try to apply the ideology of critical race theory to countries that it may not transpose easily to, or regions, for example, continents. But there's a second answer, and I think the answer goes back a generation to the New Left of the 60s and 70s, for whom the ideology, kind of maybe pre-critical race theory, if you look at Black Panther ideology, they had a very universalist ideology. It was more explicitly Marxist-Leninist, and they utilized the decolonial rhetoric as its key component. So they had a network, a political network, all over the Third World. And if you look at the writings of Paulo Freire, of Herbert Marcuse, they said that it was domestic, in the American context, it was domestic minority groups that had the greatest revolutionary potential, not revolutionary consciousness, but revolutionary violence within the First World, united with the national liberation armies of the Third World. They actually said that the national revolutionary armies of the Third World should be an inspiration for the minority communities in the First World. And so at that time, they had maybe a bit more international approach, and it was really being inspired by the very violent armies of the Third World that provided them the hope for a global communist revolution. That kind of hit the tanks. All of those countries were a disaster. Although they defended them to the end, and then in 89 to 91, it was intellectually indefensible to advocate for global communism. And that's when they had a more parochial, more elite, more academic-based movement. And then you also ask them, say, have you talked to folks? I lived in China for a year, visited many times. Like, let's be honest here. There's a lot of racism, not just in Europe and the United States. Talk to folks in China about the African subcontinent where they have business interests and work. You'll hear some very shocking phrases and ideas. So the idea though is they have to maintain the illusion that racism is exclusively a disease of Europeans and and white Americans. So it requires them, in essence, then to lie about the larger context.
I just wanted to respond on the question of the elites. I think there's something to be understood in the psychology of the dissident. The dissident has to hold together 3 tenets. One of them is, I know that the world is bad. The second one is, I know that I am good. And the third one is, I know I'm against this world. And it fits quite nicely because I know the world is bad and I know I'm fighting this bad world, therefore that makes me a good guy. You know, there's a dragon, I've got a sword, that makes me St. George. And I think this is how they think. But then comes a problem, which is, well, 2 problems, one of progress and one of power. And the problem of progress is that you can never really say, and I think the interest convergence thesis of the critical race theory, which basically says there's no such thing as racial progress because every time things improve, it's because it's a strategy by the white power to hide their racism better. So you can never say things got better. You could just say, oh, well, it got more discreet. So it's basically worse, actually. So there's a problem of progress because if things get better, if the world isn't that bad, then me, a dissident against this bad world, then maybe I'm not so good. And I think this is where there's a problem every time you try to show something beautiful about the world. It attacks their self-esteem. If you say, well, look at this wonderful, I don't know, family, no, but actually behind the scenes, there's power relations, there's racism there. Because that means the world is still bad and therefore they are still good because they are against this world. Then there's the problem of power, which is once they go up in the ranks, they're dissidents, so they're fighting the system. But what do you do when you are the system? And when you have, for example, the CEO of BlackRock, who's just given a sort of woke speech and who says, yeah, I mean, I'm really glad here we're bravely, speaking truth to power. And you're BlackRock. Who are you speaking to? And this is unbelievably widespread. I see people in France from the best and the brightest schools. And when you point out they came from the best and the brightest schools, just as all of their comrades have, they get so uneasy. Like, yeah, but I mean, I'm not a part of them. I don't really know them. I hate the school, and I know it's so elitist. And yeah, but you're a product of it. You're here because of it. And this is why I think they invented the concept of woke washing, saying, oh, yeah, sure, BlackRock, Nike, Adidas, Apple, Coca-Cola, they're all towing the line we set. But that's only in theory, that's only in discourse. They don't actually think like we do. Because if they admitted that, say, the big companies thought like they did, they'd have nothing left to do. They're against the system, and the system is spouting their words. And so they have to invent this concept of woke washing, saying, no, it's only in discourse. And another contradiction is by the people who say that everything is discursive, that everything is in language. So it's not a real counter-argument, but still. So I think this dissident mentality in our elites is really new. It's sort of anti-elite elitism. We talked about anti-bourgeois bourgeoisie. It's the same thing with a highly paradoxical nature, which touches, in some cases, borders on schizophrenia.
On that point, I noticed when I was working in mainstream newsrooms in America, you would always have this obsession with newsroom leaders, the leadership class, with improving diversity in the newsroom and hiring on the basis of diversity. It's all superficial diversity, but you never saw these people who are making these arguments. They were almost always white. You never saw them offering to resign and to make room for a person of color, in their position. But they were happy to impose, to make people, white people, heterosexual people, whatever, further down the chain, pay the price for their own bad consciences here. Secondly, I noticed that in the United States, newspapers began to fall apart in the year 2000. You can look at the graphs in terms of the collapse in subscriptions. This was because of the internet. During this time, you would have thought that newspapers would have been obsessed, newspaper leadership would have been obsessed with how can we improve our coverage to reach a falling number of people, convince them that we're relevant. There was some of that, but there was not nearly as much of that as there was of obsession over how can we get more people of color to work in newspapers. Well, as a matter of fact, journalism schools know that for whatever reason or reasons, people of color tend not to go into journalism. I think it has to do with whether or not a newspaper reading culture was inculcated at home, but that's just a fact. You can't invent these people out of nowhere. And those few people of color who do go into journalism are snapped right up by the Washington Post and the New York Times, which have the money to do that. In any case, it was referring to the parochialism. These people who ran newspapers, who ran media companies, seemed to be completely oblivious to the fact that fewer and fewer people wanted what they had to sell anyway, and they were actually more impressed with trying to impress each other over their efforts for wokeness. We see the same thing in Hollywood. I used to be a film critic, and people would wonder, well, why are movies so far to the left? It's not because those movies make money. It's because at awards time, the people in Hollywood want the esteem of each other. You could go on and on and on about that, but it seems to me that this parochialism you talk about, this idea that the whole world is a college campus, is a form of a death wish. It's people who perhaps we in the United States and in Western Europe have been so comfortable for so long that we don't think ideas have consequences. In fact, as our South African friend pointed out, when the power starts to go out, then you're going to realize that ideas, gosh, they do have consequences.
Well, it is. As a response to Janet, there may be 1 billion Chinese, but they're not all ethnic Han. Just ask the Tibetans or the Uyghurs, and maybe CRT is a virus we can send to China.
You are cynical. Wow.
That's one idea. All right, well, let's break there. I know some of us are going to be here. If there's any final questions, but John is going to have the last word. He's going to help wrap it up for us.
Well, actually, the penultimate word. First of all, on your behalf, I'd like to thank the panelists and all the speakers today. I think it's been It's been a fascinating occasion. We have a reasonably large audience here, and I think we'll get an even bigger one via the internet. And so on your behalf, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. Now, secondly, a conference like this is obviously put together by a number of people. I'm the front man on this occasion. I've had very little to do with organizing it. That has been handled by my colleague, and wife, Melissa, who has been the main inspirer of the conference. But she herself will tell us now that she herself is the front woman for a group of dedicated members of our staff. And so would you like to say a thanks to them, your colleagues?
Rebecca, Anna, Bator, Dorina, David, who am I forgetting? Jolt, Istvan, Bensik. So it is totally a collaborative effort here at the Danube Institute, and we're grateful for everyone being here to enjoy the hard work of a great staff. Thank you.